Star Trek: The Next Generation, Starfleet Academy, Mystery of the Missing Crew, Chapter 9. Fortunately, the Apsara agreed with Data's assessment of the situation. In fact, they complimented him on his inventiveness. However, as the android stood on the bridge and worked at the tactical console, he had his doubts. The questions that the Yawn had raised were valid ones. Attracting the field creators' attention might only encourage them to finish the job they'd started. Of course, there was only one way to find out. Turning to Cinna, who was handling the controls at the bridge engineering station, Data nodded. That was a signal for her to take the energy field information being transmitted by the Apsara and place it on the view screen. A moment later, the screen filled with bright green graphics. Since her own sensors couldn't detect the field, this was the only way they had of knowing what kind of damage they were doing. It would be up to Cinna to maintain the communications link, so the information flow could continue. The other Yawn just stood and watched. Their expressions were all the same, a mixture of fear and fascination. The android hoped that when this was all over, only their fascination would be justified. The next step was to aim the Yosemite's phasers at the proper point in the field. To make sure that they had the maximum effect, Data identified what appeared to be a weak point, one of several, surprisingly. Then, with his target defined, he pressed the firing button. For a unit of time almost too small to comprehend, the android considered the possibility that their earlier work in the weapons room had not been effective after all, and that the phasers would not work. Then his concerns were laid to rest as the graphics on the view screen reflected a full and direct phaser hit. However, they hadn't made much of a dent. The field was still intact. As Data watched, it began to mend itself, correcting even the little bit of damage that had been done. "What's happening?" wondered Philae. "What's wrong?" asked Odril. "We require more firepower," the android thought out loud. Focusing on the tactical board, he overrode the Yosemite security programs and diverted the energy he needed from other systems. First, he sapped the strength of the deflector shields, knowing full well how vulnerable it left them. Second, he shut down life support in every deck but the one they currently occupied. At last, with virtually all the ship's resources at the beck and call of the phaser batteries, Data tried his strategy a second time. Pressing the firing button, he scanned the view screen. This time the impact was more significant, but it still wasn't enough to punch through the field. The android followed the flow of the alien graphics. Noting how the mending process was carried out, he saw that where there were even a few slender threads of energy in a given spot, they drew in other threads to effect repairs. "It's not working," prodded Lagan. "Why isn't it working?" "We haven't got enough power," Cinna told him, "but we'll address that." She stole a glance at Data. "Won't we?" The android nodded. "Yes," he said, "we will." To penetrate the energy barrier, to attract the attention of its creators, he would be forced to, what was the expression Captain Thorson favored? Put all his eggs in one basket. In other words, he would have to pour all available power into a single blast and trust that he would not need a second one. Because if he did, there would be no power left to create it. For the last time, Data targeted the weak spot in the energy field. Locking phasers, he called for the narrowest, most intense beam the batteries could muster up. Then he fired. The view screen showed him the result. As he watched, the blast met the alien grid and tore a hole right through it. It was not a particularly large hole, but it was big enough to keep the energy field from making itself whole again. "We did it!" cheered Lagan, bursting with relief. "We ripped a gap in it big enough to fit a ship through." That wasn't exactly an accurate assessment, Data mused. However, they had indeed accomplished their goal. They had damaged the barrier to the point where its creators couldn't help but take notice, if they were still in existence. Still, as seconds stretched into minutes, there was no response. Data could see the Yawn showing signs of impatience, tapping their fingers on the bridge's workstations and exchanging worried glances.
You're not doing anything about the hole, noted Fillet. That's not a good sign.
Odril came up behind the android and surveyed the tactical monitors. He couldn't understand much of what they said, but he could understand enough to see what kind of trouble they were in. He looked up at Data. You used all the power in the ship's batteries. There's just enough to keep the life support going on the bridge, and pretty soon that will be used up too. Flay's brow furrowed.
But without life support to sustain us?
His voice trailed off soberly. Odril nodded solemnly.
We'll all die.
He glanced meaningfully at Data.
Or maybe not all of us. Only those who need to breathe in order to survive.
There was no other way, the android countered. It was either expend all our energy or resign ourselves to defeat.
Maybe there was another way, Ligon chimed in. At least we could have given it some thought. We could have talked about it. Now it's too late for that.
Wait a minute, Cinna said. Data did the best he could. None of us has any reason to... She was interrupted by a sudden flash of light from the view screen. A flash which obliterated the Apsaran graphics there and replaced them with something else. It was only after a second or two that the android realized it was a face. Of course, it was different from any face he'd ever seen before. Not even vaguely humanoid, it resembled a collection of leathery bulges supported by a thin metallic-looking stalk. If it wasn't for the mouth, black orbs set roughly where eyes ought to be, Data might not have figured it out at all.
I am Saranet of the T'Chaka,
said the alien. His voice, or perhaps it was her voice, was little more than a rasp.
I am confused. Why do you attack our field? Having discovered it, would it not have been simpler to go around it and proceed to your true target, our civilization?
The android took a step forward. I am Data of the Federation. We mean no harm to your civilization, or to any other for that matter. Our vessel's computer log will prove that, as will the log of our comrades, the Apsara. All we want is for you to return our comrades to us. The leathery bulges seemed to contract and then enlarge again, though not all at the same time.
If you mean us no harm, as you claim, what are you doing here?
We were simply passing through this sector, the android explained. We did not know that we would be disturbing anyone by doing so.
And your assault on our field?
Asked Saranet. We had no way to contact you, to initiate a dialogue. By attacking your field, we hope to prod you into communicating with us. Communicating with us. The alien made the sort of noises that humans made when something was stuck in their throats. However, he, or was it she, displayed no signs of discomfort. The android got the distinct impression that the Saranet found some small degree of humor in the situation.
Obviously, noted the alien, you were successful in your attempts to encourage communication. That was quite clever of you.
Again, the bulges of Saranet's face seemed to shrink and expand. If Data was correct in his interpretation of what that meant, the alien had assumed a more serious demeanor again. For a while, a full minute perhaps, there was silence on Saranet's part. The On began to get fidgety, to whisper among themselves, but the android didn't say anything. He just returned the alien's scrutiny and waited. Finally, Saranet spoke again.
We have decided to comply with your request and return your comrades, as well as those of the Apsara. Unfortunately, our civilization has had much contact with aggressors in the recent past, which is why we created the defense field in the first place. However, our experience has been that truly warlike races seldom try to recover their vanished comrades. They simply desist and look for easier prey.
Data felt Cinna grab his arm. We did it, she breathed, careful to keep her voice from being heard by the T'Chaka. But Saranet seemed to hear her anyway. Apparently his or her auditory sense was more acute than that of the On.
Yes, the alien agreed. You accomplished your objective. However, we require that you And the Upsara as well. Withdraw from this area as soon as your crews have been restored to you.
I regret to inform you, said the android, that we cannot do that. You see, both our vessel and that of the Upsara are in immediate need of repairs as a result of our encounters with your field. And, in both cases, one of the systems that has malfunctioned is the one which propels us through space. Again, Stronnet made that gagging noise. This time, Data was certain that it bore close kinship to laughter.
Very well, responded the alien. You will be granted a reasonable amount of time to effect the necessary repairs. What is more, we are discharging power from our field into your ship's batteries, since we know that you expended your reserves with your bold maneuver. But when you are again capable of interstellar flight, you must leave us and promise never to return.
I agree to your most generous terms, the android declared. What is more, I believe my Upsaran counterpart will agree to them as well.
Good, said Stronnet. Then we have an understanding.
In the next moment, his face, or could it have been her face, disappeared from the view screen in a flash of light, leaving in its wake the collection of Upsaran graphics that had been there previously. Data looked back at Lagan, Odril, and Fillet, who seemed to have clustered in one spot behind him. The Yon looked back.
They said they would return our crew, Fillet reminded the android. So where are...
Before he could complete his query, the bridge was bathed in a blue-white radiance that even Data had to flinch from. When it subsided, the place was full of people in Starfleet uniforms. The bridge crew had been restored, and not just the bridge crew, the android guessed, but every officer on the ship, as if they had never been gone in the first place. Captain Rumiel was standing in front of his chair. He looked around. "We're back," he whispered. "We're on the Yosemite." "That is correct," said Data, though he knew he was stating the obvious. "The T'Chaka let you go, once they realized they had nothing to fear from us." The captain's eyes narrowed. "The T'Chaka? Those are the people who put us in that huge cell?" "I am not familiar with the place of which you speak," the android responded. "However, they are indeed the ones who imprisoned you." Rumiel tilted his head to one side. "And how do you know that?" "We spoke with them," Data responded, "and they are quite reasonable once you get to know them." The captain seemed to be at a loss. "What are you saying? That you were responsible for their releasing us?" He took in Data and the Yon with a disbelieving glance. "Come on. Don't tell me a handful of cadets did that." "I will comply with your wishes," the android told him. "However, it will leave a significant gap in your understanding of the situation." The captain's eyes narrowed even more. "Then you are responsible." Slowly a smile crept over his face. "You'll have to tell me more about this, Mr. Data, later. First, I've got an alien ship to deal with." "You mean the Upsara?" asked Data. Captain Rumiel was swinging into his seat, turning his gaze on the view screen. "The Upsara?" he replied offhandedly. "Who are they?" "The Upsara," the android replied smoothly, "are the beings you're attempting to contact, whom we have already contacted. You will find that their experience at the hands of the field creators was much the same as ours, and that they will be only too happy to leave this sector, once they effect the same repairs we will need to effect." The captain's eyebrows converged over the bridge of his nose. "Repairs," he muttered, remembering. "That's right. We took quite a hit, didn't we?" Turning to his ops officer, he asked, "What's our status, Ensign Turner?" The woman frowned. "Most of our systems are down, sir, including the warp drive, though we seem to have plenty of power for the time being." She paused. "Fortunately, life support is one of the systems still functioning, though it seems it was shut off on all decks except this one until just a few minutes ago." Inwardly, Data thanked the T'Chaka. Not only had they charged up the Yosemite's batteries, as they promised, they had also reactivated the life support systems. Had they failed to do that, crewmen would be at risk all over the ship at that very moment. "And the Upsara?" continued Captain Rumiel. "They're as badly off as we are," replied Ensign Turner. The captain snorted and turned to his first officer. "Commander Latritz, you've got the con. Before we go one step further, I think I ought to speak at length with our young friends here." Rising from his seat, Rumiel headed for the bridge's single set of turbolift doors. "Cadets," he called back over his shoulder. "Briefing room, now!" Obediently, the android fell in behind the Yosemite's commanding officer. Despite the name of the room that was their destination, he was sure that their meeting would be anything but brief. After all, Data hadn't even mentioned the robots yet. Chapter 10. As Data turned a corner and headed for the ship's lounge, he observed that life on the Yosemite had returned to normal. There was no evidence of the Apsara's robots or the gravity traps that had held them in place, and the bulkhead panels that had been scarred by the robot's fire had been replaced with new ones. One other thing had not changed. As before, the crew people he met in the corridor began to whisper as soon as they had passed him. But this time their remarks weren't about his lack of blood or the color of his eyes or his skin. Now they talked about his accomplishments in their absence. "He was the one who saved us," said one. "He and those other cadets. Without them, we'd still be in that holding cell, hoping someone would come along and find us. The captain says what they did was brilliant and brave to boot. I'll go along with that. I don't think I would have had the smarts to get out of that mess." The remarks were different, all right, and once in a while one of the crew people even smiled at him. But he wished they would have said those things to him instead of about him. It would have enabled him to see himself as less of an oddity in their midst. It would have made him feel less apart. Fortunately, Captain Rumiel had been more direct with his praise. "Data," he'd said, "you and your friends showed some pretty good ingenuity. You figured out that the Apsara weren't your enemy, you found the people who made the field, and you convinced those people to let us go. What's more, based on their interaction with you and the Yon, the Apsara have agreed to a formal first contact. That's a pretty good day's work for a seasoned captain, much less a rookie who still hasn't put on an academy uniform yet. I'd say you've got a long and illustrious career ahead of you." The android was grateful for the favorable prediction. However, the captain was only one individual. Data still had a lot to prove to a lot of people. Also, Captain Rumiel had been wrong about something. The Yon were not, strictly speaking, his friends. Since the return of the crew, he had neither seen nor heard from them. It was true that he had not made any overtures either, but then he had not wished to insinuate himself where he was not wanted. Finally, the android reached his destination, the ship's lounge. He had no particular business there, but he had resolved long ago not to spend too much time in his quarters. After all, personal interaction was a necessity in the management of a starship, and the only way to hone his skills in that area was to immerse himself in public life. Perhaps someday he would be equipped to take the initiative and actually begin a conversation. For the time being, he was content to simply sit and observe. As the lounge doors opened for him, Data scanned the crew members inside. As it happened, none of the faces visible to him belonged to people he had actually spoken with the exception of one group, his fellow cadets. True to form, the Yon were clustered together at a table in the center of the room. They were so involved in their discussion they didn't even look up as he came in. But then, why should they? Just because the 5 of them had worked as a team to rescue the ship? That was only a temporary union, born of mutual danger and necessity, the android told himself, as he headed for an empty table in a solitary corner. But as he sat down, he couldn't help but wish that it were otherwise. He had valued the experience of being part of a group, and now that he knew what that was like, it made it more difficult to be separate and alone again. "Excuse me," said a voice. Even before Data looked up, he recognized it as Cinna's. She smiled down on him. "Is this seat taken?" she asked. The android looked at her, perplexed. "Taken where?" he inquired in return. Her smile widened. "Don't be so literal, Data.
It's an expression. Taken means occupied. In other words, I'm asking you if I can sit down.
As understanding dawned, Data nodded. Language could be such an imprecise form of communication, he thought, though he would have to become more skilled at it if he was to serve on a starship. Yes, he said at last. Of course you may sit. Please do. As Cinna deposited herself in the chair, Data caught a glimpse of the other yawn. They were still seated across the room, but their eyes seemed to be fixed on the android. No, on Cinna, he realized. They were watching to see what she was up to. Data? He turned to face her. Yes, he replied. Cinna leaned forward. Data, I want to be your friend. Would you like to be my friend? He could hardly think of anything that he would appreciate more. I would like that very much, he told her. There was something else he wanted to say. I wish to thank you. Her brow wrinkled with surprise. For what? For the faith you showed in my abilities yesterday. If not for you, I might not have had the courage to act in accordance with my analysis of the situation. Cinna shook her head. It's I who should thank you, she insisted. If it wasn't for your teaching me the value of independent thinking, I would never have had the strength to disagree with my fellow Jan. That was an aspect of the situation that hadn't occurred to him, and a rather intriguing aspect at that. It was possible, he reflected, for two parties to benefit from the same experience in different ways. He would have to remember that, he told himself, storing the knowledge away for future reference. In fact, Cinna went on, I've come to envy you, Data. It must be nice to be different from everyone else, to act and think as you please, without worrying that your behavior will be compared with anyone else's, to stand out in a crowd just because of who you are, in short, to be unique. This was the most bewildering statement of all. From my point of view, the android confessed, the opposite would seem to be true. I was just pondering the advantages of being part of a group, and of the comfort one must derive from such a condition. She laughed. Really? Data nodded. I am not programmed for deception, he reminded her. Although, now that I have had some time to assimilate what you said, I can see that there may be some advantages to my uniqueness after all. Of course, he still wished to be part of something larger than himself, to become an officer in Starfleet as Captain Thorson had advised. But it helped to know that someone valued him for what he was already. You know, said Cinna, leaning even closer to him, I can't wait to get to the academy. After what we went through here on the Yosemite, we should be ahead of the game. The game? He repeated helplessly. I do not understand the reference. Are you implying that... Yana held her hand up. It's all right, Data. We'll just take it one step at a time. Under the circumstances, the android decided, that sounded like a good idea.